My own family tried to have me declared legally incompetent, all so they could steal the millions my aunt had just left me. They became my jailers, trapping me in my own house, taking my keys, and treating me like a confused child while they plotted my ruin. But they made one critical mistake, and they had no idea I was about to use their own lies to orchestrate a public courtroom takedown that was more satisfying than I could have ever imagined. It had been 46 years. 46 years since I'd last laid eyes on my brother James or my sister Janet. So when the invitation arrived for a family reunion at Janet's home, you can imagine my surprise. It came just a week after the news of my Aunt Millie's passing, and the even bigger news of the fortune she'd quietly left to me. A coincidence, I'm sure. Janet's house was exactly what I'd expected, impeccably decorated cold, and smelling faintly of lemon polish and money. It was a stage, and we were all actors playing our parts. James and Janet greeted me with hugs that felt like they were measuring my spine. Their smiles were stretched so tight I thought they might snap. They asked about my health, their voices dripping with a thick, syrupy concern that didn't quite mask the frantic energy in their eyes. I've always been a quiet person, a watcher, and I watched them now. I saw the ridiculously expensive Swiss watch on James's wrist and the faint, almost invisible sheen of sweat on his brow, even in the air-conditioned chill of the house. I saw the way Janet's perfectly manicured fingers trembled, just slightly, as she offered me a glass of water. They weren't happy to see me. They were desperate. I didn't know why yet, but the feeling was as clear as the crystal glass in my hand. In the days that followed that strained reunion, their campaign of support began. It was a slow, creeping invasion. They insisted on staying with me, citing my age and my recent loss. It was our duty, they'd said, to make sure I was taken care of. At first, it seemed harmless. Janet would bring in my mail, chattering about sorting out the junk. Then James started screening my phone calls, telling me he didn't want solicitors bothering me. They dismissed my neighbors, people I'd known for 30 years, as well-meaning, but simple. My weekly coffee with my friend Martha was suddenly a health risk. They were building a wall around me, brick by brick, under the guise of family love. They weren't protecting me. They were isolating me. The tipping point came a few days later. Janet bustled in with a thick stack of papers, her face a mask of efficiency. She told me they were just routine estate documents from Aunt Millie's lawyer things that needed to be signed urgently to settle everything. She spoke in a rapid-fire burst of legal jargon fiduciary, this probate that her words designed to confuse and overwhelm. She flipped through pages pointing at signature lines. One page, she explained, was for a lovely donation to the local animal shelter, something she knew Aunt Millie would have wanted. As she guided my hand to the paper, her phone lying on the table buzzed incessantly, a frantic, vibrating hum that only added to the pressure in the room. I felt a prickle of unease, a sense of being rushed, but I signed. I signed it all just to make the buzzing and her suffocating presence stop. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The house was too quiet, too still. I got up for a glass of water, padding softly down the hallway in my slippers. As I passed the guest room where James was staying, I heard a sound, a voice. It was my brother, but it was a voice I'd never heard before. All the arrogance, the condescending bluster, it was gone. This voice was stripped bare, thin and reedy, with a panic so raw it made the hairs on my arms stand up. I froze, pressing my ear closer to the door. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, only his panicked whispers. He said the extension was denied. He said if they couldn't show liquid assets by the hearing on the 14th, they were filing the fraud charges. Then came the words that turned the blood in my veins to ice. He said with a final desperate gasp that the guardianship was their only shot. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, Please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. After a sleepless night spent replaying my brother's panicked words in my head, a strange kind of calm settled over me. The shock had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. I knew what I was up against. They thought I was a frail, confused old woman. It was time to use that to my advantage. The next morning, I went down to the kitchen, a picture of quiet compliance. James, Janet, and her husband Robert were at the table. Robert was always the quiet one, a man who seemed to have been swallowed whole by my sister's ambition. He was their weak link. I poured myself a cup of tea, my hand perfectly steady, and sat down. I waited for a lull in their conversation, then turned to Robert with my most harmless, slightly befuddled smile. I told him it must be such a relief that James and Janet were helping me through all this. Then I dropped the hook. I mentioned that Janet had told me they were having some trouble with their investment club, and I hoped that nice Mr. Abernathy had gotten his funds back after that scare last year. The name wasn't a guess. I'd seen it on a threatening-looking letter Janet had tried to hide from me a few days before. The effect was instantaneous. All the color drained from Robert's face. He started stammering, saying there was no scare, that everything with the club was booming. His panicked denial was a direct contradiction to a story James had been boasting about just yesterday, about how he'd brilliantly navigated a minor market dip. James, hearing Robert's fumbling, practically flew into the room. His face was a thundercloud of fury. He snapped at Robert to be quiet and angrily demanded to know why I was worrying my head about their finances. It was a clumsy, violent overreaction, a scene of pure hostility that tore their carefully constructed facade to shreds. In that moment, they weren't concerned family. They were cornered animals. And they had confirmed everything. In the ensuing chaos, with James berating a terrified Robert and Janet trying to smooth things over, no one noticed me. I murmured something about needing to lie down, my head feeling a bit faint, and shuffled out of the room. The moment my bedroom door clicked shut, the frail act vanished. I went to my closet, reached into an old shoebox filled with sewing supplies, and pulled out a small, unassuming burner phone. It was a final gift from Aunt Millie, tucked into a private letter with a note that read, "For when you need a voice they can't hear." I dialed the number from that same letter. A sharp, no-nonsense voice answered on the second ring. I told her my name was Carol Wilson and that her client Millie had told me to call. I explained everything to Ms. Albright, the sudden reunion, the isolation, the papers I'd signed, and the panicked conversation I'd overheard about a hearing on the 14th. When I went back downstairs an hour later, the atmosphere had changed. The mask of care was gone, replaced by a cold, simmering resentment. They sensed they'd been exposed, even if they didn't know how. The friendliness was over. Janet informed me that for my own safety she'd be holding onto my car keys, and James, with a cruel little smile, told me the landline was having issues, so he'd disconnected it to stop me from worrying. My home, my sanctuary for decades, suddenly felt like a prison. The pretty floral wallpaper seemed to mock me. It was then I understood the full truth of it. This was no longer just a fight over money. This was a fight for my freedom. My first move had shaken them, but it had also been a warning. If I was going to win this, I couldn't fight them head on. Not yet. My home was a prison, and they were the wardens, so I did the last thing they expected me to do. I crumbled. From one day to the next, I became the confused, frail old woman they so desperately wanted me to be. I started forgetting names, misplacing my reading glasses, and asking the same questions over and over. I allowed Janet to help me dress, thanking her with a meek, watery smile. When James spoke to me in that slow, condescending way, I would just nod vacantly. It worked perfectly. Their suspicion melted away, replaced by a smug, arrogant confidence. They saw my question to Robert as a lucky guess, a final flicker of a dying mind. My subsequent submission was all the proof they needed. They had won. Of course, what I didn't know then was the true depth of the fire they were trying to put out. One afternoon, while I was supposedly taking a nap, James was at his golf club, but he wasn't playing. He was meeting a man, a former friend whose face was flushed with fury. The man wasn't asking for his money back. He was demanding it. $500,000. He talked about his children's futures, about the trust he had placed in James. He threatened to go to the district attorney to expose the entire scheme. It turned out their family fund was a sham. They had used their social standing to lure their wealthy friends into a high-risk real estate deal that had completely collapsed. Now, the people they had swindled were closing in, threatening not just lawsuits, but criminal charges. My inheritance wasn't just a safety net. It was the only thing standing between them and total ruin. While they were busy placating their angry investors and preparing for the guardianship hearing, I was busy too. My naps became my most productive hours. Aunt Millie had left me one other thing, a slim tablet computer hidden in a secret compartment in her old writing desk. It was already set up. Ms. Albright, my new lawyer, had created a secure online portal where I could upload my evidence. And so I began to build my case. Every time Janet helpfully intercepted a call from my friends, I logged it. Every time James made a veiled threat about what happens to old people who can't manage their affairs, I wrote it down word for word. I created a meticulous timeline of their control, their manipulation, their lies. I was forging my own weapon in the quiet of my room. Then my arrogant brother made the mistake I was counting on. He had grown so confident, so sure of my decline, that he got careless. One evening, he sat down at my little laptop in the living room, telling me he was just checking the weather. I watched him type furiously for 10 minutes before he shut it and walked away. Later, when the house was quiet, I opened it. He hadn't just checked the weather. He had used my email account to write to Janet, and he had forgotten to log out. The email was still there in the drafts folder. It was a script, a detailed plan for their sworn statements at the hearing. It was full of fabricated stories of my confusion and forgetfulness, and it ended with a line that made my heart beat like a drum. He'd written, "Just stick to the script. The judge will see she's a confused old dear. We've got this." I saved the draft. He had just handed me the key to his own destruction. The day of the emergency guardianship hearing arrived, the 14th. James and Janet escorted me into the courthouse, each holding an elbow, performing the role of dutiful, concerned family for the world to see. I played my part too, leaning on them, looking frail and confused by the polished wood and imposing atmosphere of the courtroom. Their lawyer was a smug man who spoke of my cognitive decline and vulnerability with a sickeningly sweet tone. He painted a masterful picture for the judge, a poor, isolated old woman who had been overwhelmed by a sudden windfall and needed her loving family to protect her from herself. He presented the power of attorney I'd foolishly signed. I watched the judge's face, saw the pity in his eyes, and felt a cold knot of fear. He was believing them. It was working. Just as their lawyer was wrapping up, just as the judge was preparing to make his ruling, the heavy courtroom doors swung open. A woman entered, brisk and confident, in a perfectly tailored suit. She radiated an energy that cut through the stuffy air like a fresh breeze. My siblings froze. Janet's face went pale. The woman walked directly to the front, presented her credentials to the bailiff, and announced that she was here to represent me, Carol Wilson. It was Ms. Albright. You could have heard a pin drop. The entire dynamic of the room shifted. Ms. Albright was brilliant. She allowed my sibling's lawyer to bluster for a moment, before she politely but firmly requested to call my brother James to the stand. He swaggered up there, still clinging to his arrogance. Ms. Albright started gently asking him about his concern for me before turning to his professional life. She asked him to describe his financial situation to the court. He puffed out his chest and described it as perfectly stable. That was the moment. Ms. Albright placed a thick stack of papers on the witness stand in front of him. They were printouts of his frantic pleading emails to his investors. And on top of the pile, a copy of the draft email he had sent to Janet from my laptop. The one where he laid out their entire plan to lie under oath. The one where he called me a confused old dear. Confronted with his own words under oath in a court of law, James didn't just stumble. He shattered. The facade of the successful, powerful man evaporated, and all that was left was a desperate, terrified fraud. He confessed everything. He sobbed out the whole sordid story of the failed fund, the impending lawsuits, the fraud charges, and their pathetic, cruel plan to use my money and my life to save themselves. The confession detonated in the courtroom like a bomb. I heard a choked sob from Janet. I saw her husband Robert staring at her with a look of pure, unadulterated betrayal. Their lawyer, a man who realized in that instant that he had been used to perpetrate a fraud on the court, shot to his feet and began stammering about a recess. In the space of 5 minutes, the entire social fabric of their world, the one they had built on a mountain of lies, was irrevocably torn to shreds in a very public forum. The judge, his face like stone, dismissed the guardianship petition on the spot. He then informed James and Janet that they and their lawyer were now under official investigation for perjury and conspiracy to commit fraud. And then I stood up. I didn't need anyone's help. I stood tall and straight for the first time in weeks. Ms. Albright spoke for me, her voice ringing with authority. She informed the court that I would be freezing all of my aunt's assets pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. She added, however, that I would be cooperating fully with the district attorney's office. The power had shifted. The game was over. I was no longer their prisoner, their pawn, or their victim. I was the one who held their entire future in my hands. The courtroom victory was only the first step. The legal system would deal with the perjury, but that wasn't the real wound. The true crime had been a betrayal of trust, not just mine, but of everyone they had ever known. So 2 weeks later, Ms. Albright convened one final meeting. It wasn't in a courthouse, but in a sterile, intimidating law office boardroom with a long, polished table that felt like a mile across. I was there. Ms. Albright was beside me, and across from us sat a pale, hollowed-out version of my brother and sister. All the arrogance was gone, replaced by a gray, defeated shame. But they weren't the only ones there. Seated along the other side of the table were 3 of the primary investors they had defrauded, their former friends, their neighbors. The air in that room was thick, with a silence so heavy you could feel it pressing on your chest. When it was time, I stood up. I wasn't the frail, confused woman from the courthouse anymore. Guided by Ms. Albright, I took charge. We used a projector that shone a cold white light onto the wall. I spoke calmly and clearly, my voice never wavering as I took them through everything. First, I showed the detailed timeline I had created on my tablet, every instance of their isolation and control. Then I displayed the emails, including the final damning one where James had laid out their script of lies. And last, I put up a summary of my brother's own sworn confession from the hearing. The evidence was clinical, overwhelming, and undeniable. I wasn't yelling or crying. I was simply reading the facts of their downfall, facts they themselves had created. When I finished, a silence fell over the room once more. And then the true judgment began. It didn't come from me. It came from their peers. One of the men, a doctor who had known James for 20 years, spoke first. He didn't shout. His voice was low and heavy with contempt. He told James that the money was just paper, but the friendship, the trust he had placed in him was real, and he had burned it all to the ground. Another woman who had been my sister's closest friend simply looked at Janet and told her she didn't know who she was anymore. They didn't yell about their financial losses. They spoke of broken trust and the profound personal betrayal. This was their true punishment. Not prison, but the public stripping away of the one thing they valued above all else, their status. I watched them shrink in their expensive suits, condemned not by a judge, but by the very people whose admiration they had built their lives around. Finally, it was my turn to deliver the consequences. I told them I would not be going to the press. Their humiliation would remain within their own ruined circle. That was my act of mercy. But I would not be using a single penny of my aunt's inheritance to bail them out of the mess they had made. That was my act of justice. They would sell their homes, their cars, and liquidate every asset they had to repay the people in this room. Ms. Albright made the final point clear. Any failure to cooperate, any hesitation, would result in my full and active participation in the district attorney's fraud case against them. I was reclaiming my autonomy, my peace, and my inheritance. Not with the messy, satisfying rage of revenge, but with the clean, sharp, and undeniable blade of justice. The aftermath of that meeting in the boardroom was swift and quiet. There was no grand explosion, just the slow, silent collapse of two lives. Within a week, a for sale sign was hammered into Janet's perfectly manicured lawn. I heard a short time later that James's wife had left him. The social exile was absolute. Their names, once spoken with respect at the country club, were now whispered as a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. They had built their lives on an illusion of success, and once that illusion was shattered, there was nothing left. Their gilded cages were now just empty, echoing rooms. From what Ms. Albright told me, my siblings chose two very different paths. Janet, humbled and completely broken by the public shame, seemed to find a flicker of something real in the wreckage. She took a menial job at a department store, and she started going to therapy. It was a long, arduous path toward understanding the entitlement that had poisoned her, but it was a path. James, however, remained trapped in his own bitterness. He refused to accept any responsibility, blaming me for his downfall, for exposing him, for not simply handing over my life to save his. He learned nothing. As for me, I found that my new life was just beginning. Aunt Millie's mansion was beautiful, but it was large and impersonal, a monument to a life that wasn't mine. So I sold it. And with the proceeds, I worked with Ms. Albright to establish a charitable foundation in my aunt's name. It's dedicated to providing free legal aid for seniors who are facing elder fraud and manipulation from their own families. I reconnected with my old friends, my real family. My weekly coffee with Martha was back on. My days were filled not with fear and strategy, but with purpose and the warm company of people who genuinely cared for me. I was no longer a target or a victim or a recluse. I was just Carol, a vibrant and respected member of my community. And that brings me to now. I'm sitting on the porch of my own modest, comfortable home. My neighbor, whom my siblings once dismissed as simple, just brought over some fresh tomatoes from her garden, and we shared a good laugh. The burner phone and the tablet are long gone, tucked away in a box somewhere in the attic. The only tool in my hand these days is a simple gardening trowel, its handle worn smooth from use. I am at peace, my independence is secure, and my days are my own. I realized that I had not only protected the inheritance my aunt left me, but I had transformed it and myself into a legacy of strength and wisdom. And in the end, I learned that true wealth is never about what you have in the bank. It's about the character you build in your heart. In the quiet that followed the storm, Carol's true victory became clear. It wasn't found in the courtroom drama or in the ruins of her siblings' lives, but in her own quiet resilience. She learned that the most powerful response to betrayal isn't revenge, but the deliberate act of building a better, more purposeful life. By transforming her inheritance from a weapon of justice into a shield for others, she proved that true strength is measured not by the battles you win, but by the good you create from the wreckage.